last weekend, I got a church newsletter from home church in Oklahoma. And they're getting ready to begin a major building campaign of remodeling the facilities that I grew up in and watched build and be dedicated. And it prompted me to sit down and just kind of write a couple of pages to the current pastor. And in the process of doing that, it put me back in touch with that community of people who really fundamentally, certainly in addition to my own parents, shaped my sense of call and vocation. I think at every step of the way I've had not only a family but a congregation or a community setting, for better or worse, that was telling me what I ought to be, but supporting me in the journey. In their days, I am fairly confident I became a parish minister as much because the communities around me said, boy, you sure ought to do that, you'd be good at that. And I'm glad they did, and I'm glad I went to seminary, and I'm glad I served in the parish for a while. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that whole sense of vocation is it can be so directive too, and I won't say manipulative, but in a sense of that. And as I wrote the letter, I was thinking about all these extra parents that I had, and you and so on. And that same sense of vocation, took me to a particular college, the same one my parents were. And again, a set of people were very instrumental. And when I think back, almost every decision that I made was as much because particularly two mentors, they didn't tell me what I ought to do, but they were pretty directive, both in recruiting and in pushing. Very clear that I went to seminary in New York and out of the Midwest because of one philosophy professor who said, get out of Oklahoma, you can live. There's a whole group of us, I could name dozens myself. He said, come back to Oklahoma and Kansas, but go away from here. You've lived, you've grown up. So that was a different kind of and again, as I try to sort through my own grasping, when I left Oklahoma, it was to become a church history professor. I had no intention of really becoming a parish minister. Again, bumped up against New York City and a particular person, in this case Bill Weber, who's in East Harlem Protestant Parish, and I began to really rethink entirely parish ministry and repeat. So again, it was always contextual. I think I was there making some decisions all along. I think I was meditating on and asking what God wanted me to do. But God's voice really was pretty muted, partly because I wasn't listening much and wasn't asking much, but partly because the other voices in the community around me were so strong. And I'm sitting here teaching now because the same kind of thing happened in the parish. The voices around me, civil rights movement, Vietnam War, as much drove me out of parish as it pulled me into a different way to make a living. And so again, my own journey in that regard has been push me, pull me kind of thing, that I left the parish to go to graduate school so that I could find a new way to make a living and not be dependent on the institution, but I fully intended to still be a parish minister part-time and teach part-time. But then higher education says you can't do that kind of thing. You got to pick one or the other. And anyway, the Presbyterians who were experimenting with this, let's call a pastor in the Chicago area, and everybody in this congregation will make a living on their own. Nobody's going to get paid. By the time I finished graduate school, that experiment was proving not very successful. So, here again, my call has been a lot of false starts, and a lot of just more contextual. Now, in that sense, I hope there has been a continual openness, and it's usually been driven by being a part of one or more worshiping congregations. Throw Augsburg into it, I guess it's 3. A lot of us in St. Martin's, so I guess I was trying for 4. My family ridicules me. But at the same time, it's kind of a love, I won't say love-hate, that's too strong. It's a courtship with a worshiping Christian fellowship that is as much a source of my consternation as my own growth and development. So when I think of vocation and call, it's a pretty rocky, wonderful, half empty, as much as half full journey. And when I look at each of my 5 kids, I try hopefully to get back to see where they really are right now. What communities they can be part of. That's I guess I ended by saying what has been, and I feel truly privileged. Because another part of that sense of vocation is that every step of the way, my being a white male, has made my indecisions and my journey incredible. Whether it was fair-haired boy in local congregation, when all the boys were being recruited, whether it was struggling along and going to seminary at a time when ground rules were, if you've got a wife, she works and that's your scholarship. Or when I got ready to go to grad school to figure out a new way to make a living, women weren't going to school, minorities weren't being actively recruited, in the middle of the war, and draft-eligible males weren't being given scholarships, and I had my way to get to graduate school because I was a slightly older, with child, like me. And so how I separate out vocation and call from just all the doors that have just almost always been there. Not that they aren't available there for some people occasionally, but that's part of the journey that I think is an important piece when I look at our students. And this reminds me as I end this. When I look at our own students, we've often discussed this, I would say 75% of them have never in their lives had the kind of ongoing message to them from parents and teachers. You really can do anything you want to do. You can go to graduate school. I really think it's a fair number that 75% of our students have really never gotten the message that the sky's the limit. That they can they don't even find themselves really students. They find themselves as what? Most of them have never even been pointed to and said, boy, that's really good work. Look at you in one of my classes. And it was that whole experience of vocation from the time my faculty was born. Mrs. Stansbury in the 3rd grade calling my mother and saying, boy, Jerry sure did bring up this little test we gave as an experiment. And again, that's driven my sense of calling.
I think, interestingly enough, for me, I think it was actually 2 calls. And actually, they were both phone calls. And I know that sounds isn't as shallow as making the comment about the coffee, but running the risk of that, here we go. In the fall of 1975, I walked to the first Lutheran church I ever been in. 3 years earlier, I married a man who was a lapsed Catholic, but definitely not a lapsed Christian. I grew up Presbyterian, very comfortable in that tradition. But given Les's need to do some healing and to find an alternative way to worship, and to have a chance to let the dogma and doctrine inform us subtle little, we worshiped with papers for 3 years and felt very much at home there. But when our second daughter was born, and we had our first daughter baptized with a friend's child, we looked at each other and said, it's time to go back to a liturgical sacramental church. And I said, well, you know, we bypassed that big Lutheran church on the way around like Harriet. Everything I said, you know, you've seen the size of that parking lot, and they probably have 2 services. And I've heard they're kind of strict about money. I don't know. He said, I'm not asking to marry him. They just thought maybe we try worshiping us. And I'm somebody who often feels really awkward in a new liturgical setting. I want to know when you're supposed to stand up, sit down, fight. You know, I don't want to sing it if I'm supposed to say it, or say it if I'm supposed to sing it. I don't want to stand out initially. And so it often is not a very worshipful experience the first time living in liturgy. Les and I looked at each other after the first service, and we looked at God, we said we'd come home. Preaching wasn't particularly good. Didn't have no idea of liturgy, but there was a sense of at home. So that a few months later, they asked for volunteers to help for Vacation Bible school. But I could definitely sit at a table and wipe off 30 fingers and hold crying kids. I mean, that's something I knew I was good at. And so I helped out. And the call came actually a month later in July from one of the women that I had worked with that summer, and she happened to be the confirmation director. And she said, you know what, I'd like you to teach 7th grade confirmation in the fall. Well, I made Moses sound positively affirmative when God asked him to go to Pharaoh. I said, oh, are you kidding? I said, I've been a Lutheran for 9 months, and I have 2 preschool children, and Les is a chief resident and OB at the U, and we have 1 car, and he needs it 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 364 and a quarter days a year, and I hated being in junior high. I had promised myself I would never teach junior high age kids anything. They wouldn't like me. I wouldn't like them. I could never pray in public. Ask me to do anything else. I will stuff envelopes. I will scrub toilets. Just do not throw me into the den of 7th graders. She persisted. And as a girl that can't say no, I said, all right, but I will do it for 1 year, and only 1 year. Don't even think about asking to do it again next May. And 23 years later, after having been director of it for 13 years, I came to Augsburg. It was God's good gift and surprise. It taught me about really depending on the work of the Holy Spirit, because I for sure. This is nothing, number one, this is nothing I wanted to do. It is nothing I felt prepared or in any sense equipped to do or having any predilection to do it. So I was really surprised by it and learned to lead. And of course, it was the most wonderful odyssey in faith. I knew that 7th graders didn't listen when I prayed. They didn't give a what I said. In fact, I knew I could probably share some pretty hideous heresies, and they would come out unscathed because they wouldn't probably have learned them. It was a most humbling process, and I learned a lot about faith development. I thought my job the first year, as somebody trained as a teacher, was to pop that hatch, put in as many faith pellets and information sheets as I possibly could smush in, and then cram it shut and sit back and watch and get ready for the harvest. Oh, silly me. 23 years later, I realized that it was my privilege to be involved in some soil preparation. I had nothing to do with seeds. I had nothing to do with the rain. I certainly rarely had a chance to see the harvest, except for one of these wonderful moments at Augsburg when kids that I had in combination came over and gave me a hug. And actually, one of the kids was a senior major in the family ministry. And I think God has surprised him as much with that as God surprised me with this. The second one was a call on voicemail that I chose not to pick up because we were eating dinner in September, a year and a half ago. And it was Dick Cardell's voice saying, "Hi, Marilyn, this is Dick Cardell. I'm still at the office. Why don't you give me a call? I think I'm going to surprise you." I had been learning from the Institute for about 10 years at that point. I had been on their Institute Council, which was their board of directors, for 5 years, and I had chaired it for 2, and so I'd gone in to meet with the staff. And I knew that they were in the process of designing the job that I now have, and I looked at it and I thought, oh, I just wish that those things. Just wish that was the package of who I am. But it is so not me. I can't believe it. So I thought Dick was calling to tell me they had found somebody. And when I called him back, he said, "Well, we have 7 really well-qualified candidates, and on paper they're everything we're looking for, but not one of them seems to pop up as this is the one, this is the person." And he said, "So we really prayed about it a lot, and we feel moved by God to call you." I paid attention. And I'm honest enough that I have to say I am incredibly flattered. I am tickled and delighted, and I don't think it's my kids at all. I think it would be a raw deal for the family. I just don't see myself as having the requisite gifts or skills. And it was not about false modesty. Believe me, this was about what I thought was a pretty healthy assessment of who I am. He said, "Well, we think differently." And I said, "Well, I'm going to come about it." And here I am. So I would say there has been a huge element of surprise and of, what could God be doing in this? And a knowledge that this is not something I sat in my room and thought, how could I get that? Because it never in a million years would I have thought that. However, I would piggyback with what Gary said. It is people being loving reflectors, being my mirrors, holding up a mirror and saying, this is how I see you, even when I didn't see myself that way. It is many of those same people and some other people. I'm shoulder to shoulder with you, arm in arm with you. We will make this happen. We won't let you down. It is also recognizing in my own rearview mirror that everything I had done in my life up until then was in equipping ministry, including being in junior high. Nothing in the world prepared me better for being utterly empathic and caring and loving and supportive once I discovered I didn't have to be in junior high again myself. Than having remembered in my body what it was like to be in junior high. I realized that all the work that I had done in confirmation, with the theology, having been a parent educator for 22 years, everything else had prepped me to do the job I'm doing now. And then recognizing that it's still a heavy load on the Holy Spirit. Because I think this is not what I'm doing. While writing my work. Believes that one of his gifts is to be a gift maker. And I am so grateful for the people in my life who were gift makers, even when I was saying no to them. So I think vocation, my experience, has been that it involves a call, sometimes the most implausible, using relatively modern technology. And but more than that, it involves people reflecting something to me that I couldn't see when I sat down for the awareness.
I think this is interesting because we were told to think about this, and I haven't really thought through my life this vocation. But what's interesting about these stories is that things that are was kind of thinking one path. And in student perspective, and when I realized this, we both talked about kids, and we both talked about intentionality, and also the fact that things is capital that we have to account for. One of the things that always surprises me when I work with students is that they come in and appeal to them, if their life planned out, and it all depends on where they get their students, of course.
They'll be sitting in a room like this.
But, you know, I'm always suspicious of people who have their lives planned like that, because I know that I can't plan like that. In fact, I come in, I don't think I know what to do in college, and then I go to do, I learn about it, and then I do that. And they graduate or go overseas, or do logical things like management school. But I would teach that, so improvising. But along the way, I think, again, the idea of unique gifts, if you're going to be talking to students who I think, as Gary said, you have a lot of relation from the family to our family, and just in the process of education. Kind of a guiding question. And it seems to me that one of the things that they have to accept is they have to do. And the second is that they have to ask themselves ultimately, am I fulfilling God's purpose for my life and my work? And are you fulfilling God's purpose for doing my work? Are you going to? And that's the question you ask, and you don't get many of us don't be black. But I think the realization along the way, but I think that's what we do as students.
When I was thinking about my vocation, I don't have how I can admit this in this room, but I think I've termed it differently. And for me, it's more a matter of stages of development in an adult, and being in that middle part of my life, I think I'm more reflective, so I have more to reflect on. So I looked back and I thought about, so how did I end up here? And doing the job I do and liking what I do, when there was no intention to it, at least that I understood. I didn't go to college to become a proposal maker. And so I think probably maybe 15 years ago, I started thinking a lot about what I call more spiritual things, and feeling like that, at least for me, and I think most of us, we're presented with people with experiences, and how we choose to respond is what makes a difference. And so I came to really think about, and obviously not every day, so I'm never being intentional as I should, but I try to be more intentional about, so why am I presented with this situation or with this person? What am I supposed to learn here? And then try and move forward. So that's kind of where I am today, but when I go back and I think about the students that we all want to write this wonderful proposal so that we can have a more significant impact on the students. I think I'm probably like many of our Augsburg students. I didn't have much direction. I grew up in a pretty close family, but torn apart by alcoholism, and kind of low income, but with a clear direction I was going to go to college. But probably from when I was 5 years old I had control of my life. I was driving it. And, you know, looking at my son now, I get a little discouraged because I think, you know, if I would have wanted that, whatever he's telling me he wants, I would have figured out how to do it. And so I think, what's wrong with him? And then I step back and I think, okay, we're different people, that's why. He doesn't have the same gift, I guess. So he wants me to give it to him, or figure out how to do it for him. But anyway, so I didn't have a lot of direction, and I think a lot of our students had that. I had more direction on, no, you know, you're not going to drink, you're going to go to college. I figured out how I was going to go to college. I grew up in a church, Episcopal church, went to church camp, did all those things. But when I went to college, I was mainly thinking not about if I had some gifts that this college was going to help me do it, but so am I going to get registered for that course? Am I going to, you know, go to this dance with this particular guy? You know, how am I going to graduate? How am I going to have enough money to pay my bill? What should I major in? Well, let's see, at that point, women could be teachers or nurses. I guess I'll be a teacher. Hated student teaching because I student taught junior high kids. Never again.
Echo.
I thought they were just the most cruel human beings. What? Until it's well, yeah, I kind of wanted to skip that age too with him. But, so I fell in love with somebody who was going to seminary. I think in a way I was living vicariously. I was thinking, I'll come all through him. You know, so he went to seminary. I worked at Southern Methodist University in development. So that was my first, it was like, oh, this is easy. It's right on campus. You know, it's a big city. I can walk to work. It's temporary. And of course then we moved to another academic community in New Jersey, so I worked at another university. By then I was coming into this. So whether it was a call, I don't know. Whether it was, I mean, I admit it was easy to work at SMU. It's like, okay, this is an easy job. I can do this. It's, you know, sort of mind-numbing. It wasn't challenging. I wasn't happy there. But it was something that bought the groceries, and it was close. And I think this whole rambling story is to say, I'm not sure people who are 18 to 22 are in a stage to be reflective. And I think being reflective is required in order to understand where you are in your life and why. And so I'm just introducing that into the whole conversation about as we progress throughout the next 6 months. Can we force faith pellets into their head, as I would say, and say, believe me, later you'll reflect on this.
You know, I would like just to check on that. Just in listening to this, I'm struck by that intentionality and how little intentionality I had. You know, although I grew up a Catholic, I remember praying that I wouldn't call the priesthood. The worst thing. I'm glad to see Luther doesn't quite follow that stream, but you know, I'm always struck by. I went to a Jesuit high school because that's where everyone in the neighborhood went. I went to the local college, didn't think of anything else because that's where my parents went. Got married because everybody got married. Never thought I would say, well, am I going to choose to have a single life or something? Never, you know, the idea of having children, I mean, that was so totally not having children, so totally off. Certainly my wife's probably my radar screen as well. I mean, it's almost, frankly, this, I mean, I'm just struck by how how little intentionality I felt I exhibited, perhaps. You know, and in a way, I mean, I think my kids have much more intentionality and are more aware of their decisions. And in the way teaching at Augsburg is probably one of the first as a career change. And I kind of wonder about vocation. I mean, it's almost, I wonder if people think more about vocation later in life than they do at the beginning, even though obviously when you're both just starting out, it's probably better to figure out what direction you're going. Maybe it's easier to do that later, even though you've already made, you have less degrees of freedom perhaps because of the prior commitments. You know, in a way, just in the last couple of years, I've enjoyed the notion of making a vocation decision. I'm sort of struck by that the difference is, especially as I see, you know, I think what I've impacted some of my children's decisions, certainly, just like me, it's community. Let's say in my daughter's case, who went to Valparaiso, going to a college and being mentored by a professor was totally a life-changing and steered her life in a totally different direction than she ever imagined. She had it before when she kind of walked in, before she sort of walked into the life. I don't know, you know, I think that certainly resonated with
I want to add my piece to this conversation. Again, I think vocation is well caught in my, it's a very personal and individual, a special call. And many times they come to parents, they come to the community, leaders from the community, or just people that see happy. But also I think vocation is such an important component of how we shape up our mind, heart, and life in the service of this work. Especially in today's world, we no longer do vocation as an individual, personal, and intimate call, but also vocation these days is about growth, it's about globalization. So I think as we talk about global economy, I think in this proposal, definitely we need to start talking about global vocation. How is it should be done? As you know, I grew up in Guatemala. I came to this country one thing that I always have thought of the United States, I don't know what happens, is that sometimes, speaking as an North American now, sometimes we think this our call is to save the world. They're not to build it, not to make it better, not to improve it. And this really takes me to what really God didn't come to the beginning of the earth. God was about creation. God was about putting things together. God putting pieces together. And I think that's a call for all of us. Because in many ways, we all are vocations in this world. Either as a professor, either as a dentist, either as a doctor, or a carpenter, or an electrician. We all really and establish the I think of the young people in today's society, perhaps they have a harder time to really see or understand or perceive or reflect on the word of vocation. Because I was fortunate to have parents who don't have love, they don't have that. My parents went to school, my father went to school. I was the only one there in school. But one thing that I had, they had the wisdom to guide me the right way. They knew that I had a journey up ahead, but they really told me or they taught me that to be good, that's the way to do it. If I'm good myself, I'm good to people around me, therefore the world will be good. And that takes me to the younger people in today's world, or today's society. Unfortunately, we have a different structure of our family structure, as for community structure. They don't have the balance to guide them, especially illness or emotional problems, either with drugs or emotional causes, spiritual causes, or economic causes. One thing we don't talk about is how the money factor has been such a problem in our society. We don't talk about it. We talk about addiction, alcohol, or anything. We don't talk about addiction to wealth, the addiction to materialism. And that's very destructive. And many kids, as we said, they don't have the time to do that because for them are totally caught up in the idea of materialism. They measure success, they measure vocation up, how the beautiful car will get around, how the beautiful house will be there, and how the beautiful passion will be there. But what we are losing in the whole thing, that vocation of building beautiful here in this world, even the world for that, the world for all of us. We all are in this world. I think it's so profound to think of it. We believe in one God. We never thought of believing just one God. But there is something behind just one God, which means that we share a common ground, which means we are in just one place altogether. And we better work together as people, as human, as sons and daughters of God, and we should continue God's work, which is very, very important for us.
Makes me think of when I was in 8th grade, I took one of those, what will you be when you grow up, kind of inventories, and I must have listed my salary level too high. Because I came out as a truck driver or a pipe fitter. And I took this twice, in 8th and 9th grade. Not sure how well I would have done with either of those, but I would have gotten paid more. I don't know how much I thought about vocation. In fact, the word probably didn't enter my radar screen as a high school or college student necessarily. But I think of the root to call out and remember the communities in which I was placed, mentors in high school and college who called out for me certain gifts and cheered those on, cheered me on. And as I reflect back, I'm not sure if I directly thought about it, but all the Bible stories, the call stories, Isaiah, Jeremiah, no, I don't have the words, I'm too young, I can't do this, was there swirling around in my head, I'm sure, as mentors and teachers and my parents would call out certain gifts, and I might say, no. For instance, I can distinctly remember one summer when I was a canoe guide, week in, week out with a group of 7th graders, believe it or not, or through 12th grade with usually their pastor. And it would be a group of 9 or 10 of us. And that whole period of that small community, working together 24 hours a day, canoeing, worshiping, eating, really literally serving each other, carrying each other sometimes, called out for me, I think, a sense of call to think about what would it mean to be a pastor, in a wide sense of the word. And I think biblically I sort of fought against that and kicked and screamed, and when I thought about going to seminary, unlike everything else in my life, I didn't prepare for it, I didn't sign up for classes, I went through drop ad slips. It's totally unlike the rest of my academic experience. And I was just going to try it out for a year, and I was going to prepare to go to graduate school to teach. And it was then the community in which I was placed on internship, Holy Family in Chicago in the city. Again, it was the voices of that community that pushed up against my own sense of, I'm here at seminary to go to try to go to grad school and teach and higher ed. And it was this group of people, again, another community, that called out for me a variant in that course. And I think that pattern happens over and over again. And for me, there are certain times of wilderness where that call needs to come again. It needs to be drawn out. The congregation I served before, there's some times when it's just so loud, and other times just feel like you're barely hanging on, and it's the power of the Holy Spirit through it all that carries me along. And then as I'm thinking about vocation, doing some other work with vocation, there's a critique I have, especially of Luther's view of vocation. It says, all our calls are important. As a wife, as a husband, as a child, cleaning the house, washing the dishes, what we do from day to day. There's always, for me, been a critique in that, looking at issues of justice, which I think affects our students. Not all, like many of you said, have the same choices, financially, monetarily. Think of my friends in Chicago who, to say, this is the whole of your life, let us bless it, would be one thing for them to say that, and another for me to say that. There has to be an ethical piece, I think, that comes in a critique that Luther's views don't fully work today. They need to be critiqued. We don't live in the same world. So I'm also conscious, when Gary, you said the strong words, the strong calls you had from professors and mentors that might have not necessarily been your choice. Very conscious of that as I'm listening to students, how easy it is to just see from the outside and see these great gifts and go for it, do this. And the tension between trying to listen to what's underneath some of their words, other choices, other swirling around, how the Spirit is working. Pretty conscious of that too, because how easy it would have been for me to maybe make another. All right, one other thing in there, I just, Jonathan and I have been talking about, every so often we get into conversation about calling vocation, and I fall into this sin of lifting up call stories in Scripture that are just of prophets and priests. And that is certainly not the case. I think the church has done the world wrong in doing that. In Sunday school materials, in our sermons, in our prayers, there's so many more call stories. Zacchaeus, Mary and Martha, it's all over King David. And that's a place, I think, where the church can give a gift if we include all those stories.
I had a quite different experience with, I grew up mostly in the state school system and Catholic, and had like a real split, and it seemed like the more I grew, the greater a sense of religion and my life was separate. It was, this happened here and this happened here. And I grew up in a pretty interesting community where it was mostly, it's a small community of German Catholic. Most of them were family. I was Polish, so I was the scapegoat sort of in the community, and there was a lot of abuse in the community as well as in the family, and in the church there was a lot of kind of some crazy things that were going on. So I think when we did some studies here some time ago, when we talked about the resilient child, and one of the biggest elements that happened in the life of a resilient child was a strong connection spiritually with God or some higher power. And that's the one thing I did feel. I always felt like I had a relationship with God. Like even if I sat in church, I was like listening to what was going on or watching what was going on. Very young, I remember being able to talk to God and have that direct relationship. And in the Catholic Church, I saw the outside of the Bible once. And I went to Catholic